Here is something that most Tolkien fans completely miss. Galadriel, one of the wisest and most powerful beings in all of Middle-earth, carried a grudge that stretched across thousands of years. And the man at the center of that grudge was already dead before the events of The Lord of the Rings even begin. His name was Fëanor, and the wound he left behind was so deep that it shaped Galadriel's entire journey from the blessed realm of Valinor all the way to her eventual departure across the sea at the end of the Third Age. So today we are going to dig into exactly why Galadriel never forgave him, what he actually did, and why this ancient conflict matters so much more than most people realize. Let us start with who these two people were, because the scale of this rivalry only makes sense once you understand what both of them represented in Elven society. Fëanor was, by almost every account, the greatest craftsman and the most gifted mind the Elves ever produced. He was a Noldor elf, the son of the High King Finwë, and from a very young age it was clear that he was extraordinary. His name in the Elven tongue literally translates to something like Spirit of Fire, and everything about him seemed to embody that. He was passionate, brilliant, inventive, and proud to a degree that bordered on catastrophic. He created the Silmarils, 3 jewels of such breathtaking beauty and such profound magical power that they essentially became the most valuable objects in the entire history of Tolkien's legendarium. He also created the Fëanorian script, the system of writing that would eventually be used by everyone from elves to dwarves to the men of Gondor. He was, in almost every measurable way, a genius. But Fëanor was also something else. He was possessive in a way that went beyond reason, territorial to an extreme that would ultimately destroy his entire family line and drag thousands of elves into centuries of bloodshed. And Galadriel knew this about him from the beginning. Galadriel was also Noldor, but from a different branch of that family. She was the daughter of Finarfin, and the granddaughter of Finwë through a different line, which made Fëanor her half-uncle of sorts. They grew up in the same world, in the same blessed land of Valinor, under the light of the 2 trees. And even in those early days, before the darkness came, there was already tension between them. Here is where things get really interesting. Tolkien tells us that even in Valinor, Galadriel and Fëanor were already at odds. Part of it was personal and part of it was philosophical. Galadriel had an extraordinary gift, her hair. It was described as the most beautiful hair of any elf who ever lived, shimmering with a light that seemed to capture something of the 2 trees themselves, something of both their gold and silver radiance woven together into a single person. And Fëanor, whose entire existence revolved around creation and capturing beauty in physical form, was apparently captivated by it. He asked her 3 times to give him a strand of her hair so he could use it in his craft. And 3 times she refused. Now think about what that means. This was not just a minor social snub. This was Galadriel saying no to the greatest craftsman in Elven history, a man of enormous pride, a man who was used to being admired and deferred to. She looked at him, and she said no. And Tolkien suggests she did this because she saw something in Fëanor that troubled her deeply. She sensed the darkness in his spirit, the possessiveness, the pride that had already curdled into something dangerous. While others were dazzled by his brilliance, Galadriel saw what lay beneath it. So from the very beginning, there was no love lost between these two. But the refusal over her hair was only the opening note of something much more devastating. Then Morgoth came. The great enemy of the Valar, the original Dark Lord before Sauron ever rose to power, had been imprisoned for ages, but was eventually released under conditions of what was supposed to be reform. Instead, he spent his time poisoning minds, spreading rumors, and above all fixating on Fëanor's Silmarils. And then, in a catastrophic night, Morgoth struck. He destroyed the 2 trees, the sources of all light in Valinor. He murdered Finwë, Fëanor's father and the High King of the Noldor. And he stole all 3 Silmarils and fled to Middle-earth. What happened next is where Fëanor's story truly becomes a tragedy, and where his sins against Galadriel and everyone else become unforgivable. Fëanor, consumed by grief and rage, made an oath. Not just any oath, but one of the most terrible oaths in the history of Tolkien's world. He swore, along with his 7 sons, by the name of Ilúvatar himself, that they would pursue anyone who held a Silmaril and refused to give it up. Anyone, without exception. Elf, man, or anything else. They would pursue that person or being to the ends of the earth and beyond. This oath was essentially a self-imposed curse, a declaration of vendetta so absolute that it would override every other loyalty, every friendship, every moral consideration. It was the act of a man who had completely lost perspective. And then Fëanor made his case to the Noldor. He gave a speech, one of the most famous speeches in all of Tolkien's writing, urging his people to leave Valinor and go to Middle-earth to reclaim the Silmarils and win their independence from the Valar. It was passionate and electrifying and deeply manipulative. He played on their pride, their desire for freedom, their anger at Morgoth, and many of the Noldor listened, many of them followed. Galadriel followed too. But here is the crucial thing. She did not follow because of Fëanor. She followed despite him. Her reasons were her own. She had always longed to see Middle-earth, to rule her own realm, to be free of the sometimes stifling authority of the Valar. She had independent ambitions that had nothing to do with Fëanor's crusade. But she still ended up marching under a banner that was essentially his, and that would have consequences she did not fully anticipate. The problem was ships. The Noldor, in their vast numbers, needed to cross the sea to reach Middle-earth. And the only ships large enough to carry them belonged to the Teleri Elves, who lived on the shores of Valinor and were the master seafarers among the elven kindreds. The Teleri refused to help. They were loyal to the Valar, they had no quarrel with Morgoth that required them to go to war, and they were not going to hand over their beloved ships just because Fëanor demanded it. Fëanor's response was one of the darkest moments in elven history. He ordered his people to take the ships by force, and when the Teleri resisted, fighting broke out. Elves killed other elves for the first time. The kinslaying at Alqualonde, as it came to be called, was a massacre. Teleri elves were slaughtered at their own harbours for the crime of defending their own property. Galadriel did not initiate the attack. The evidence in Tolkien's writing suggests she actually fought against Fëanor's followers during the kinslaying, defending the Teleri rather than attacking them. But she still continued the journey afterward. She did not turn back. She crossed into exile carrying the weight of what had happened, and the Valar responded by pronouncing a doom upon all the Noldor who continued. The doom of Mandos, a curse of sorrow and failure that would hang over their entire enterprise. Now here is the part that tends to get glossed over. Even after the kinslaying, the nightmare was not done. The Noldor had ships, but not enough for everyone. Fëanor and his followers took the ships first and crossed to Middle-earth, promising to send the vessels back for the others. They never did. Instead, Fëanor burned the ships on the shores of Middle-earth in a fire that could be seen across the water. He stranded the rest of the Noldor on the wrong side of the sea, including Galadriel, including her family, including thousands of elves who had followed in trust. They had to march north through the grinding ice of the Helcaraxe, a frozen wasteland between Valinor and Middle-earth, where elves died from cold and exhaustion and danger. Many perished making that crossing. Galadriel led part of that march. She watched people die on the ice because Fëanor had decided he would rather burn the ships than share them. And then, after all of that, after the kinslaying and the betrayal and the terrible march, Fëanor died anyway. He was slain by Balrogs shortly after arriving in Middle-earth, consumed by the very fire of his own spirit. His body was incinerated so completely by his own burning passion that almost nothing remained. He died before he could reclaim a single Silmaril, and his oath fell to his sons to fulfill with predictably catastrophic results. So let us now think about this from Galadriel's perspective. She watched Fëanor drag the Noldor out of paradise with his golden tongue. She watched him engineer a massacre of innocent Teleri elves to get ships. She watched him strand thousands of her kin in the freezing north and burn the only way home. She watched people she cared about die on the Helcaraxe ice. And then he died without ever truly facing justice for any of it, without ever being held accountable, without ever having to look at what he had caused. The doom of Mandos, the curse he had called down on all the Noldor, kept right on working its terrible way through generations, even after he was gone. And here is something psychologically fascinating about why this wound never healed. Fëanor's death did not close the chapter. It opened it wider. His sons kept pursuing the oath. The oath led to more kinslayings. It led to the destruction of elven realms that had nothing to do with the original quarrel. It led to a second massacre and a third. Each time, Fëanor's shadow fell across the scene, his oath working like a poison through time, killing people who had been born after he died. Galadriel lived through all of it. She was there for the long centuries of the First Age. She was there when elven kingdoms rose and fell. She was there when the oath of Fëanor's sons destroyed Doriath, a great Sindarin realm, because one of the Silmarils had come to rest there. She watched that catastrophe ripple outward in waves of grief. Remember that the Sindar, the elves of that realm, were people with their own history, their own culture, their own king and queen. The enmity that certain elven groups like the Sindar and those descended from them carried against the Noldor exiles for thousands of years afterward was rooted directly in what Fëanor set in motion. Galadriel herself had complicated relationships with the Sindarin world. She eventually married Celeborn, who was Sindarin. She lived in Doriath and learned from Melian, its half-divine queen. She was not an outsider to Sindarin grief. She understood it from the inside. But there is another dimension here that is even more personal. Galadriel carried her own guilt alongside her anger at Fëanor. She had followed. She had not stopped the kinslaying. She had continued the march after the burning of the ships. The Valar had placed a ban on her return to Valinor because of her participation in the rebellion, however principled her own motivations might have been. She was exiled. And in a strange way, Fëanor had done that to her too. His choices had forced her into a situation where her own choices were constrained and compromised. When you understand that, you understand why forgiveness was impossible. It was not just about what Fëanor had done to others. It was about what he had done to her trajectory, her future, her very identity as an exile from the land she had once called home. Every time she looked at the stars from Middle-earth, she was looking at the sky of a world she had been forced into by a chain of events that Fëanor had initiated through his pride and his possessiveness and his absolute refusal to consider anyone's needs but his own. And consider this. Galadriel was wise. She was patient. She was capable of remarkable self-reflection, and she grew over the millennia into one of the most spiritually evolved beings in Middle-earth. She proved this at the end of the Third Age when Frodo offered her the One Ring, and she refused it, even though she could feel its power pulling at her, and she knew what she could do with it. That refusal was an act of profound moral courage and wisdom. Yet even this most patient and wise of elves never forgave Fëanor. That tells you something about the depth of what he did. This was not a small thing that wisdom could simply process and release. This was a wound at the foundation of her entire existence in Middle-earth. Every age she spent in the world, every battle she fought, every grief she witnessed, every elf she watched sail west because the world had grown too dark for them, all of it traced back in some way to that original catastrophe. There is also the question of what forgiveness would have even meant here. Fëanor was dead. He had gone to the halls of Mandos and, unlike most elves, there is no record of him being rehoused in a new body. Some interpretations suggest he remains in the halls even into the modern age of the world. He never came back. He never apologized. He never faced the consequences. He never looked at the people he had hurt and acknowledged what he had done. Forgiveness in cases like this is not simply an act of letting go for one's own peace of mind. It is also a moral reckoning that requires something from the one who caused the harm. Fëanor never provided that. And then there is the question of the Silmarils themselves and what they represented to Galadriel. The Silmarils were created by Fëanor, and they captured the light of the two trees. That light was, in a very real sense, the light of paradise, the light of the world before the darkness came. When Galadriel eventually received a gift of light from the star of Eärendil to place in her mirror, it was a kind of answer to that loss, a piece of ancient light preserved and passed forward. But the original light, the light of the trees, was gone because of the chain of events that Morgoth and Fëanor together had set in motion. Morgoth destroyed the trees, and Fëanor refused to give back the Silmarils, which were the only remaining vessels of that light. Even when giving them back might have allowed the trees to be restored. Galadriel was in Valinor during the years of the trees. She had lived under that light. She knew what had been lost, and Fëanor, through his refusal, had ensured it could never be recovered. Now, here is what makes this even more layered and worth thinking about carefully. Galadriel herself was not without ambition and pride. She had her own desires, her own longing for power and independence. She had followed the rebellion at least partly because she wanted to rule. She knew this about herself. And Tolkien seems to suggest that part of her lifelong wariness toward Fëanor and his legacy was also a kind of recognition. She saw in his pride a distorted reflection of something she had to constantly guard against in herself. The One Ring's offer to her was an amplification of exactly that same temptation. Power, mastery, the ability to reshape the world according to your vision. She refused it, and in doing so, she earned the right to go home at last. But Fëanor had not refused. He had embraced that impulse completely, and it had destroyed him and everyone around him. Galadriel's story across the ages is, in many ways, a story of learning what Fëanor never learned, that the desire to possess and control, however brilliant and gifted the one who holds that desire, leads only to ruin. She spent thousands of years working through that lesson while living with the consequences of his failure to learn it. And at the very end, when she finally passed over the sea and the ban was lifted and she could go home, it was partly because she had succeeded where he failed. So when people ask why she never forgave him, the real answer is layered and profound. It was not simple bitterness or inability to move on. It was a recognition that what Fëanor had done was woven into the very structure of her life in ways that could not be undone. The kinslaying, the betrayal of the ships, the burning, the march through death, the curse, the generations of violence carried out in his name, the loss of the original light of the world, her own exile. All of these things were his. Not entirely his. The world is not that simple. But they originated in his choices, and he never came back to answer for them. The question asked in this video was why Galadriel never forgave Fëanor. But the deeper question it points toward is this. What does it mean for an immortal being to carry a wound across literal ages of the world? Most human grudges fade because we die. We move on, or we run out of time, or we simply forget under the weight of new experiences. Galadriel had none of those escape hatches. She remembered everything. She had been there. And every new tragedy that echoed the original one was a reminder. That is the tragedy at the heart of this question. Not that Galadriel was unforgiving, but that she was wise enough to see clearly what had been done and honest enough not to pretend otherwise. If you found this deep dive into the lore of Middle-earth fascinating, you are going to want to stay around because we have a lot more coming. There is something almost addictive about pulling at these threads in Tolkien's world, because every answer leads to 3 more questions, and the further back you go, the richer and darker and more complex the story becomes. Hit subscribe and stick around, because we are only just getting started on some of the most overlooked and underappreciated stories hiding in the margins of Tolkien's legendarium. And if you have a theory or a perspective on Galadriel and Fëanor that I did not cover here, drop it in the comments. I genuinely read them, and some of the best ideas for future videos have come from exactly those conversations.